Former President Donald Trump is clarifying comments he made in Ohio Saturday, warning of a bloodbath.
After a lot of prayer and reflection, I've come to the conclusion that I won't be endorsing Donald Trump this year.
Our basic freedoms are under assault. Freedom to vote, freedom to choose, and so much more. My predecessor and his allies in Congress make no apologies for it.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Former President Donald Trump still facing criticism for those controversial comments he made at a campaign rally over the weekend. Now his former Vice President Mike Pence is refusing to endorse him. And the state of former President Trump's finances aren't looking that good right now. His lawyers now say today it's, quote, a practical impossibility to secure a bond for his $464 million civil fraud judgment. Meanwhile, President Biden is busy campaigning and spending time in the Oval Office. His campaign says they raised $53 million in February. Today, the president also spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu about humanitarian aid needed in Gaza. Finn Gomez and Jake Rosen join us now. Finn is our political director here at CBS News. Jake, a top-notch campaign reporter. Let's begin by listening to former President Donald Trump's comments over the weekend at his rally.
Let me tell you something to China. If you're listening, President Xi, and you and I are friends, but he understands the way I deal, those big monster car manufacturing plants that you're building in Mexico right now, and you think you're going to get that, you're going to not hire Americans, and you're going to sell the cars to us. No, we're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars. If I get elected, now if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole, that's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it.
Finn, what's the Trump campaign's response today to how this is all playing out? It's a controversy that's sparking criticism from Democrats. Some Republicans have urged Trump to use different kinds of words, even if he's talking about the context of the automobile industry.
They say that, and I spoke to several members close to Trump today, and they say that this has been strongly taken out of context. They believe that this is an issue that he's been railing on for since the 80s, and they believe that the bloodbath comments, he was referring specifically to the auto industry. Of course, Jake was there, and and you talk to others, and critics say that this is essentially a dog whistle to his base. But among the Trump advisors, they believe that this was specifically about the auto industry.
So this is one part of the rally. Jake, you were there on the ground covering it for CBS News. Put aside the controversy over this specific passage of the speech. What exactly is Trump doing right now as the general election campaign ramps up to stoke his base, to maybe underscore certain grievances? What's the read from digesting it all from the site?
Well, I think the big thing, Bob, is what he did at the beginning of the rally on Saturday. And it was saluting to the Justice for All song, which is a song that features Donald Trump and also some of the January 6th defendants held in the D.C. jail. He saluted the campaign PA announcer that basically calls Trump on the stage, said that they were hostages. Trump repeated that at the beginning of the speech. And he also saluted as a video played showing the violence and destruction on that day of police officers being injured. And I think that's a really important thing when we consider the kind of 3,000-foot view here of Trump's content, Trump's claims on Saturday, and Trump's comments about bloodshed and bloodbath. I just think that's a really important thing to remember going into his grievances on 2020 and how he repeated, that the election was rigged even just a couple minutes ago on a radio show interview. But he did admit Saturday that he did lose the election, but that grievance is 100% still there. I mean,
January 6th hovers over this entire campaign for Trump. He is talking about those facing prosecution for the insurrection as hostages, as Jake said. Right. And this position, this framing of everything on January 6th by Trump has led his own vice president, his former VP, Mike Pence, to go on Face the Nation and say he can't endorse Trump this time around. Let's listen to what Pence had to say.
I said it during my presidential campaign. The president and I have profound differences. And many people think it's just over January 6th. And frankly, the fact that the president continues to insist that I had the right to overturn the election that day is a fundamental difference.
So this is a campaign where many Republicans would prefer Trump to be talking about the border, talking about the economy, but he's not moving away, it seems, Finn, from January 6th and his own false claims of winning the 2020 election. There
has been some frustration, Bob, with some members of the Trump team that he is continuing to talk about this, and especially the way that Jake just described. They want him to focus on more, general election issues. They want him to focus, yes, on immigration, yes, on the economy, like he did in Ohio. But they, and by steering in this direction, he's essentially talking to the choir, right? He's already speaking to the base that already agrees with him on this front, and that he needs to expand his perspective now as we are firmly in the general election.
Speaking of the word choir, help us understand, as someone who covers the Trump campaign day in, day out, Jake, there's a choir of January 6 people who were involved with the attack on the Capitol in some way who sing. What's actually the backstory for this entire scene at a Trump rally? So the background is that the January 6 defendants who are being held at the D.C. jail, some of them have been adjudicated, their cases in the court of law, some of them have not, and they're still there. Most of the people who are there, by my understanding, is people who were there for violent actions. These were not just people who strolled into the Capitol that day and were brought in by the crowd, basically. They have been singing. There were protests almost every night, as our colleague Scott McFarlane has reported on every night, with whether it's Ashley Babbitt's mother or other big players in that day going to the jail to basically show their support. And every day at a certain hour, they would, do the Pledge of Allegiance, the national anthem, things like that. And basically, this is a recording that they had of them. And the Trump campaign allowed Trump to clearly participate in this. They encourage it. They play it at rallies, almost every rally now. But it's a mesh of Trump saying the Pledge of Allegiance and these defendants singing the Star Spangled Banner as kind of a rallying cry for not just January 6th in itself, but just the last 3 years of saying that these, quote, unbelievable patriots, as Trump said Saturday, are being wrongfully, detained as hostages. Stunning scene. What about Pence, though, Finn? What's the political impact, if any, of having your former vice president sit out in terms of endorsing your campaign?
I think it's historic. I mean, you have to go back to 1912 when you really have any sort of historical reference to something similar, where Teddy Roosevelt ran against his former vice president. But you're looking at a point now. Where does that Pence voter go?
The traditional Republican.
Traditional Republican, establishment conservative, if you will. Sort of similar to, if you can even make an argument, similar to that Haley voter, right, that we've been talking about so much earlier in their cycle. But, do they hold their nose and vote for Donald Trump, even if they disagree with him on certain issues? I mean, he was talking about that Donald Trump had walked away from certain conservative principles, including that pro-life stance, including, a limited fiscal, responsible government, and even his position on TikTok. But frankly, I mean, there really isn't another option, one would think, and speaking to some members of that establishment class, if you will, who say, what they likely would not vote for Biden, even though the Biden campaign does firmly believe that they can make a serious play for that voter.
In terms of the VP selection this time around, it's clearly not going to be Pence again. Who's the Trump campaign looking at? Who are Trump allies talking about? Well, I'll point to Saturday. That's probably the best example of that. We saw South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem flew to Ohio to go give a stump speech for Bernie Moreno, the Trump-backed Senate candidate there. Jim Jordan was also there, and so was J.D. Vance. And I think we've seen this in real time, whether it was in New Hampshire with Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina going up there to basically support him continuously. Vivek Ramaswamy was also in New Hampshire right ahead of that primary. But I think we've seen, I would maybe call them auditions, but I think they've been given time on stage with Trump and before Trump arrives to the venue to basically show the crowd what they have to rally their candidates or in support of a candidate. And I think that's just something to watch going forward, is how these allies are rolled out continuously. Quickly.
What a race, though. That Ohio Senate primary race. I'm really interested in this one.
Who wins? Matt Dolan, Bernie Moreno?
If Matt Dolan wins, what does that say about Donald Trump's sway?
He's endorsed by Senator Rob Portman, former Senator Rob Portman, among others of that ilk.
And the governor of the state, Mike DeWine. Right. So, I mean, that is really, it goes back to like the 2022 midterm cycle where there's that candidate quality issue that we talk so much about. If he loses that race and Matt Dolan wins, what does that say about Donald Trump and that key state that has become red in recent cycles? I really think there's a lot of interest in that outcome. And I'm one who's going to be watching intently tomorrow night.
Jake Rosen, Finn Gomez, we really appreciate you stopping by. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Next, the latest from Capitol Hill, where lawmakers once again are racing against the clock to avoid a partial government shutdown. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Congress has until the end of this week to reach a deal to avoid a partial government shutdown. Now, if lawmakers fail to do so, funding for several departments, including Homeland Security and the IRS, will run out. I'm sure some Americans won't mind that. Scott McFarland joins us now, our congressional correspondent. Scott, you're tracking everything. Where exactly do the negotiations and the discussions stand?
They have saved the thorniest, trickiest issue for last, like a procrastinating college student. This Homeland Security funding has always been the trickiest for the U.S. House to navigate, and that's what they've got to get done to avert a partial shutdown by Friday midnight. It's because it involves funding border security, border agents, all the things that are so synthesized into the 2024 campaign, and all of which are such wedge issues right now between the two parties. You see there all the agencies that can be funded by the end of the week, and it must be funded to avoid this shutdown. Big ones like the Pentagon, like justice programs. But Bob, the reporting we have today is that it's Homeland Security funding that right now has held up progress, and they're running out of time to make progress.
Scott, walk us through the calendar.
Yeah, it's not a pretty sight. You sure you want to go down that path? They have until Friday to figure out how to fund these agencies, but there are other deadlines between now and then. Typically, you have to give the U.S. House 3 full days, 72 hours to review text once it's on paper. And right now it's not yet on paper, and we're getting close to 72 hours away. What's more, the Senate can do what it does, throw up procedural hurdles or procedural issues that can stretch the calendar further. All of this still must be done by midnight on Friday. I'll note one thing. There's a shred of optimism among those who don't want to see a standoff. Next week is Congress's spring break, and they tend not to want to mess with their own district work periods. Which
members are you watching on those talks? Who really has power? Who has say over the final deal?
So much of this is centralized with leadership because the U.S. House is working around its normal procedures. The narrow margins in the House mean they need a tidal wave of Democratic votes to get anything done, which is a novel concept to this Congress. So all of this is centralized. Typically, this would go through committees like the Rules Committee. The appropriators would have a lot of say. The Rules Committee, to a degree, is irrelevant right now because they're not following typical rules. This comes down to the Speaker of the House and either one of two, the Senate Democratic leader or the White House. Who is he talking to at any moment of time will dictate how fast this gets done.
Is Speaker Johnson getting any pressure to have a shutdown?
There's a voice from the House Freedom Caucus, which has been consistent from the jump on this. And when I say the jump, I mean September 30th, when all these standoffs began. And in a letter they issued as the evening began tonight in Washington, they asked their members to toe a hard line against these spending bills unless there are policy changes to border security, something they've been championing from the start of the impasses. They're doing so again. They're the dissenting voices who I think may say, better there be a shutdown than for us to come up short on changes at the border.
And CBS News has obtained surveillance video showing what appears to be people erecting gallows and a noose, which was seen during the January 6th attack on the Capitol. What exactly do we know about what is a new development here, what's worth paying attention to?
It's one of the few stubborn mysteries that remains from January 6th. Who erected those gallows, that horrific sight from the west front of the Capitol? This video here, exclusive to CBS News, shows the movement of the pieces of the gallows from the 6 a.m. hour, Bob. 6 a.m. January 6th. There they are going across Union Square. And what the House subcommittee investigating January 6th tells CBS News is that this construction began shortly before 7 a.m., hours before the White House ellipse speech, hours before Mike Pence was called upon to overturn the results of a lawfully held election. And the question is now, who are these people and how has it been 3 years since they've been found? A fuller version of that footage available on CBSNews.com as members still try to answer that very intransigent question.
You've been speaking to lawmakers about a lot of these issues.
The chairman of the House subcommittee, Barry Loudermilk of Georgia, says this is a pressing issue for his panel. Take a listen more of what he had to say.
This is before the massive crowds got to the Capitol. There were plenty of Capitol Police there. We've reviewed the radio traffic of Capitol Police that day, and there's no mention of it. Even though the crossbar of the gallows wasn't erected until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the base platform was there. And that in itself is against Capitol Police policy and rules.
Let me add one more note, Bob. We've reviewed 1,300 January 6 criminal cases. 1,300. Not a one references anybody alleged to have taken part in that gallows, at least not yet.
Scott McFarland, thanks for being here. We really appreciate your reporting. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court has now indefinitely extended a stay on a controversial immigration enforcement law in Texas. The law allows state officials to arrest migrants accused of crossing into the United States illegally. The Biden administration is challenging the measure. A federal appeals court is set to hear arguments about the case next month. And the role of the First Lady, it has changed significantly since, well, Martha Washington. We'll explain how. You're streaming America Decides.
People need a healthcare system that controls costs and provides security to families. And I know the American people share the urgency that I feel, the sense that we must act now.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was then First Lady Hillary Clinton back in 1993 talking about her signature issue at the time, health care. The role of First Lady has changed a lot since then, especially in the last 30 years. New York Times White House correspondent Katie Rogers joins us now. She is the author of the book American Woman, The Transformation of the Modern First Lady from Hillary Clinton to Jill Biden. Katie, congratulations on the book. It's a terrific read.
Thank you.
I've learned a lot, especially about First Lady Jill Biden. You spent time with her during the course of your reporting. What was the big takeaway about her influence in this administration?
I think my big takeaway is that she is way more influential than I think she would publicly say or acknowledge. I think that she is somebody that her husband trusts implicitly. I think he's somebody, as you know, who has a very small circle of advisors and confidants around him. And at the center of that circle is the First Lady. She is not involved in every sort of policy discussion. I think she was involved in his student loan forgiveness program, for example, because she is an educator. But she's involved in everything political. She was part of the team that signed off on the No Malarkey bus tour in 2020, and she is somebody who watches closely over campaign videos and how he looks and presents himself. She's somebody who really is looked upon to sort of say, yes, this is letting Joe be Joe. This is the Biden we know. She's very, like the keeper of sort of that legacy along with him.
A true confidant of President Biden. I thought it was really intriguing how you look at Hillary Clinton's experience and how that forged how the First Lady often operates in the modern era. Why did you decide to use Clinton as a sort of tentpole in this broader discussion?
I think because she was the most ambitious modern First Lady that we have had. I think Eleanor Roosevelt is sort of the standard bearer for a First Lady who really took on her own initiatives and spoke on behalf of the president and held her first, her own press conferences and the like. But Hillary Clinton was somebody who had a law career. She was educated. She had the confidence of her husband on a policy-making level to take on healthcare. He assigned that to her within months of taking office, and really looking at, what they call in politics the scar tissue that came with the Clintons sort of pushing too far, too fast on an initiative and having the First Lady as sort of the leader of that. So that was one major reason. And another, it's just the 90s were a decade where our technology was changing rapidly. The discourse around politics was beginning to really change. The Clinton impeachment really was the precursor to what we see now with tribalized politics. So she really just seemed like a natural bookend to sort of exploring this, I guess, generation of millennial First Ladies.
When I was reading your book, it seems like I used to think the worst job in Washington was vice president.
Yeah.
But this job of being First Lady, the first spouse, if we have a first female president in the coming years, it'll be the first spouse or whatever they end up calling it.
It'll be interesting to see what they come up with.
Because first gentleman, it seems a little like 19th century.
It does.
But this job is vague. There's no job description.
Yeah, and it's not even a job. It's, I call it in the book, the most scrutinized volunteer gig in the country. And it's really the only role in American politics that you can think of where somebody is expected to do this out of the goodness of their heart. And it is a job that can be incredibly isolating. Half the country doesn't like you no matter what you do. Actually, I think Jill Biden's polling is 30 like her, 30 don't like her, and 30 don't know who she is. So you're up against a divided American public. So really, it's a volunteer role. It's completely optional, and that was something that Melania Trump really illuminated, I think, for the country too, with the way she took on the role and its expectations. And
it's an important role. I mean, you think about former vice presidents; they lose Secret Service protection. First ladies keep it forever.
Yeah, and in my conversations with Jill Biden, she had talked to me about what you actually lose with that living in the bubble, as it were. She asked, how would you feel if you could never drive a car again? When she wants to open the window at the White House, the Secret Service has to clear the park below. So it's a really privileged life. Don't get me wrong, but it's also one that is very isolated from the life you or I would lead. And some of the most interesting parts of researching and reporting this book, it was looking at those moments where first ladies would try to break out of that and keep something for themselves. And Jill Biden's career is that for her.
Now, we have an unusual circumstance potentially with a former First Lady, Melania Trump, maybe coming back to the role of First Lady. What's your assessment of her and how she sees the role, especially should she come back?
So I think she's an interesting figure in the sense that she enjoyed the title of being First Lady and the pomp that came with that, the ceremonial trappings of the role, much like her husband liked all of that with the presidency. But I think that she is somebody who did not like the scrutiny that came with living in the White House. My reporting suggests that she would be, supportive of being, him running and being First Lady again. She would do it. But I also don't have reporting that suggests that she would move to Washington full time. She delayed her move the first time by several months to get her son settled. She likes her life in Florida. So I think she's somebody that only she really knows that decision and what it's going to look like till she has to make it.
And final thing, what should we really be paying attention to with First Lady Jill Biden in the coming months before the election? What are you watching?
I'm watching how she speaks about Donald Trump, the former President Trump. She is somebody who's really gone directly at him and his track record, particularly on women's rights and reproductive rights. She is somebody who's an enormously popular surrogate for her husband. She's a fundraising draw. I think her fundraising emails are a huge grassroots donor draw. So I think I'm looking at what she is saying as she tries to strike a deeper contrast against former President Trump and her husband.
Katie Rogers, the author of American Woman, really great read, insights into our country, the East Wing, a lot to learn from this role and this book. Katie Rogers, thank you.
Thanks.
That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.